Hello, I'm Jacqueline Moroz, the director of the Literary Festival. Thank you for joining us today for our special Global Voices Festival. Talk today is with two debut novelists from Iran and Sri Lanka. The festival benefits Succeed Together, a nonprofit based in Montclair that provides free educational services to disadvantaged children. If you'd like to support our program, you can donate via the link in the chat. I want to thank all our volunteers and festival sponsors today, including Rayo's Homemade, Ameriprise Financial, and West of Hudson Realtors, as well as our bookseller, Watchung Booksellers. If you have a question for today's speaker, you can click on the Ask a Question bar on the bottom right of your screen. We are so fortunate to have as our moderator today, Nancy Starr. She is the author of 6 novels, including her latest, Rules for Moving. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other places. She lives in Montclair. She will be joined by Ruvanee Pietersz Vilhauer, author of The Mask Collectors, a literary thriller set in New Jersey and Sri Lanka. In addition to her novel, she is a science writer and formerly taught psychology at NYU. She lives in New Jersey. They'll also be joined by Amir Ahmadi Arian. He started out as a journalist in Iran in 2000 and has published a collection of stories, a nonfiction book, and 2 novels in Persian. He currently lives in New York and teaches literature and creative writing at CUNY City College. Then the Fish Swallowed Him is his first novel in English, and it gets a nice mention in this weekend's New York Times Book Review. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. And nice to see you all here, those I can't see. And those of you out there I can't see, welcome to joining us. We're really happy to be here, part of the festival this year. Amir, let's start with you, if you don't mind. I know this is your debut novel only in English. You are an accomplished writer of books before that as well, starting out as a journalist. I wonder if you could describe for us in your own words, if you could tell us what Then the Fish Swallowed Him is about.
Yeah, it's about a bus driver in Tehran. First of all, actually, I have to thank you, to you and all the people who put this festival together under these circumstances. Yeah, we really appreciate it. I think I myself and I can be sure that I can speak, on behalf of all the other authors you guys have invited here. We're very, very grateful for your work. Yeah, this novel is about a bus driver in Tehran in 2004, 2005. And this is a guy who is basically a nobody. He spent his whole adult life just driving buses around and no involvement in politics or anything else. But through a friend, another bus driver, he, kind of becomes familiar with the bus drivers union, and he joins them. And he is politicized over time. And so the novel begins when, the bus drivers union has orchestrated a strike in Tehran in 2004. And this guy joins the strike. And after that, other things happen. And then he is eventually arrested. And he's taken to Evin prison, which is a kind of notorious prison for political prisoners in Tehran, north of Tehran. So the bulk of the novel is set in the prison, and it's basically divided between his time in solitary confinement and an interrogation room. So you've got the second kind of main character of this book emerging in prison. Our Said is his interrogator. So that's basically kind of the plot, and other things happen later, which I won't give away. So
well, can I just say I loved the book.
Thank you.
I think everyone should buy it. There's your little green buy the author's books here, which I recommend you do for both of these authors, both of whose books I loved. Yunus is a nobody, but to me that also means he's an anybody. And so I really traveled through the book feeling like him. I'm not saying I know what it's like to be in solitary confinement, but I think you did a very good job of creating some of what that must feel like, a tiny, safe little bit at a distance, as well as letting us in on that complicated relationship between interrogator and interrogated. So I really think it's a great book. So thank you for that. And can you read us a little bit and give us a little taste?
Sure, thank you, sure. The bit I'm gonna read is from page 107 for people who have the book. And so here we're inside the cell, in solitary cell with Yunus, and this is the moment that he encounters a fly. Then I saw a fly. The insect, fresh from the free world, was sitting on a slat in front of the open window, rubbing its feelers together. It seemed to be deciding whether to come inside or turn around and fly back out. Its body made a dot on the narrow strip of light between the window slats. The position of its black shadow created the illusion that the edges of the slats bent in towards themselves and made the fly look bigger than it really was. It eventually made up its mind and launched itself into the cell. It maneuvered around briefly, took note of the walls and the ceiling, and alighted back on the slat. Please stay a little longer. The words left my mouth before I had even thought of uttering them. The fly stopped rubbing its legs like it was weighing my offer. Then it tiptoed to the side of the slat and stood in profile to me. I came to my knees and followed its moves closely. The fly flew into the room again. It floated straight toward me, circled above my head, drifted away, spiraled down, looped back around, and hovered near my face. I closed my eyes and listened with pleasure to its delicate, ear-stroking buzz. Then the fly approached the window but pulled back quickly. It made another turn around the cell and paused over the toilet bowl, carved out short circles in the air, lowered altitude as meticulously as a helicopter carrying wounded soldiers, and landed on the vomit smear. It jabbed its proboscis into the dry vomit and began to feast. When it had eaten its fill, the fly tore its body off the toilet and took another pass around the cell. It approached the slats 3 times, pulled away at the last second, and returned to hover over my head. It then sped up and zigzagged, swooped down, and landed on my arm. Goosebumps rose up on my skin under its feet. It tiptoed around up to my elbow and back to the middle of my arm and paused there. I watched it with admiration. It seemed like a perfect machine. Even the coloring was beautiful, with its gradual change from black to gray. Its body was tiny and frail, and about a quarter of it supported the disproportionately large compound eyes that captured the world in 1,000 simultaneous discrete images. Its feelers settled on my skin and rubbed one another at a carefully calculated frequency, gathering data, or perhaps just enjoying the company of the other living organism in the cell. Okay, just leave it here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And Ruvanee, so happy to have you here as well. So this is your debut novel, yes?
Yes.
Before that, you published a book of a short story collection, The Water Diviner, which won the Iowa Short Fiction Award and was longlisted for the Wonderful Story Prize. And there are flies in your novel as well. I don't know if you're going to read anything about the flies, but you guys can talk about that off screen later. Can you describe The Mask Collectors?
Yeah. First of all, I also want to say thank you to Jackie and the Montclair Literature Festival and everybody else who has been involved in the festival besides Jackie. And thank you to Nancy for moderating this so kindly, and also to Amir. And for everyone out there who's listening, thank you as well. So my novel has 2 main protagonists. Duncan, who's an American anthropologist who studies Sri Lankan exorcism ceremonies, and his Sri Lankan wife, Grace, who's a scientist who studies flies, fruit flies. And the novel is really about, broadly speaking, about the way that culture influences belief and the way that belief can have sometimes really visceral effects on the body. The book starts at a high school reunion, an international high school reunion that Grace used to attend, a school that Grace used to attend. And many of the friends that she knew in school are still in touch with her. And some of these people from the school are other characters in the novel. So Duncan, the anthropologist, has lost his job. He used to be a university professor. He lost his job, and then he was hired by a pharmaceutical company. And the pharmaceutical company is interested in his research on these exorcism rituals, which are also called devil dancing rituals, or tovil. And it's initially unclear why they're interested, but then, through the story, you find out what their interests are. And it turns out that their interest is really very different from Duncan's interest in these rituals. And there's actually, I forgot to mention that the story starts with a death at this high school reunion. And it's a journalist dies, and the story really is about trying to figure out what happened to the journalist. Was she murdered? How did she die? And, then Duncan and Grace start to learn about this conspiracy that's going on with the pharmaceutical company. And so I think I should probably start there and not go further. But I want to mention that the story is set both in New Jersey and in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this book so much. It is, I read it as a thriller. It has a lot of things in it, but I read it as a thriller. And you can't forget that I think there's a body on the first page. Right. As in many great books, you just you're right there. But also the book has that other thing that in a novel like this, one loves so much, which is an entry into a world that most of us don't know a lot about. So I found it really fascinating, and it was, job well done. It held me to the very end. So can you give us a taste? I don't know if you read about the flies, but.
Yeah, this is not going to be about the flies, but the person who studies flies is in it. So okay. At least that's something.
The funny thing is, before you go, the novel that I'm working on now has a journalist who mysteriously dies, and people want to find out.
Wow.
And also, I would like to just say that Ruvanee worked as a therapist in prison. So you two just definitely
Wow.
Yeah. I'm going to say go have lunch once that's possible. You have a lunch.
Definitely.
Yeah, we will.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll come to it.
Okay, so I'm going to read from a section early in the book. Duncan has been recently hired by this pharmaceutical company, which is called Cinesat. And he has found out that the Cinesat is using these Sri Lankan exorcism ceremonies as a way to promote a new drug that they're developing. That sounds terribly implausible, I know, but hopefully by this point in the novel, I've convinced the reader that there's a good reason why Cinesat's doing this. So the bit I'm reading comes after Duncan has met with a Cinesat researcher called Weinberg. And Weinberg has told Duncan that Cinesat has films, videotapes of exorcism ceremonies from Sri Lanka. And in this scene, Duncan is talking to his wife, Grace. "Tell me more about the hotshot," Grace said. Duncan had already told her a little about the meeting on the phone. He shrugged. Weinberg was okay. I think I'll get along fine with him. We're meeting again tomorrow. He's going to give me a data set, or at least that was what he called it. About 14 hours of film footage, clips of 2 different Towel ceremonies. Wait, Grace said, frowning. These are real ceremonies with real patients? I know, Duncan said. This was in some village? Duncan nodded. He'd been incredulous too. But how? People are so secretive about all that. Even in the villages, all the stigma? Who would want to broadcast the fact that they're having an exorcism? That's what I said, Duncan said. When he had lived in Sri Lanka, in Gaul, it had taken months to earn enough trust to get the village folk to let him observe the ceremonies. He had understood their concerns about having a foreigner in their midst. He had been careful to show his respect, remember that he was their guest. But Weinberg said a local had filmed them, with the camera mounted at the scene. Grace shook her head, looking unconvinced. At these things, aren't people really worried about doing the ceremony properly and not getting possessed by demons and all that? Duncan pursed his lips, remembering Weinberg's smirk when he'd expressed incredulity at the existence of the films. Money talks, I guess. Weinberg didn't exactly say that, but that seemed to be the gist of it. They compensated the patients' families and the exorcists. You know, Towel are really costly. He smiled, realizing that Grace would have no idea about the cost of an exorcism ceremony. Okay, right. The exorcists charge for their work, obviously. On top of that, they ask the family for a whole long list of materials for the Towel. All kinds of plants, incense, cloth, a rooster, pots for the offerings, a lot of other stuff. They need coconut leaves for weaving the offering baskets, plant and tree trunks and coconut leaves for building the structures, the little hut-like things, you know, where the patient sits, where the demons are supposed to be confined. A lot of food has to be prepared for the exorcists, the guests, plus they need food for the offerings. All of it cost thousands of rupees even back then. A lot more now, I'm sure. Anyway, Sinosat paid for all of it. Grace was still frowning. These are whole ceremonies? All-nighters? Yeah, they're long. They're both Mahasona exorcisms. Seeing her expression, Duncan explained, you know, there are different ceremonies for exorcising different demons, right? Depending on the patient's symptoms. Different demons are responsible for different kinds of problems. These ceremonies are for Mahasona, the great cemetery demon, one of the most powerful demons, responsible for a lot of bad stuff. He grinned as Grace rolled her eyes. When he'd first met her, he had been steeped in the practices he had been observing in the villages near Gaul. He had thought it strange that she knew next to nothing about demons and exorcisms, far less than he, a foreigner, did. It was only after he'd spent some time in the city that he realized her family was not unusual in being ignorant of all that, or in their disdain for the rituals village folk considered quite mundane. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I realize that these books are disappearing because there are 3 of us, but here is this beautiful book and this beautiful book. So I just wanted you to see those. Oops. Okay, thank you both for reading from your books. Here's what I want to ask you about. You had these first careers, right? So journalist and psychologist. And I'm curious to know if you could talk to us about your desire to write, how early that came, whether you were writing before that, fiction writing, I will say, Amir, because obviously journalists write, and how you think those years you spent in those other professions impacted your choice of what you first wrote about, how you look at the world. Maybe you would have liked to have just gotten right to writing fiction sooner, or maybe you feel like you really got a lot from those early years doing something else. So Ruvanee, maybe you can start, and then Amir, I'd love to know what you think about that.
Yeah, so I started writing when I was a teenager. I was always really interested in writing, but just for myself, you know, I just felt compelled to write. So I write these things that nobody ever saw but me. But I never thought of writing as a potential career option. It was always something that I did on the side as a hobby. And I was very interested in science from the beginning, particularly biology. So I actually studied biology before I got into psychology. I have a master's degree in molecular genetics. I worked in a fly lab. and then after that, I got into psychology. I was interested in the mind-body connection. So, there is a tie-in with the stuff that I write about here as well. And then, after I started working as a professor in psychology, I kept writing fiction on the side as a hobby, fiction and essays. But I never thought about really doing anything else with it for a long time. But I won some literary awards fairly early on, which spurred me to think about maybe getting short stories into journals, and then I started publishing those. Then started working on my novel, my first novel, around 2010 or 2011. That was a failed novel, but it was good practice for writing this Mass Collectors. I definitely use psychology in my work, in my writing, because, developing characters and figuring out motivations for characters really uses my background in psychology. I also use science, at least in this novel, and the other novel that I have just written, which I'm revising, definitely also has science in it.
Your first career had a big impact, and
yes, definitely,
they're very different.
Yeah.
Amir, what about you?
Yeah, I from like the cultural context that I come from, the lines that separate these different forms of writing, these different genres, are pretty blurred. So a lot of like fiction writers, there are journalists too. A lot of them, write plays, write poetry. So when I actually was like writing my, biography, like bio for these events and for the note, when I wrote like I started off as a journalist, I never, thought of the fact that in like an American context, it actually kind of brings up this question that, oh, he had a career before. Becoming a fiction writer. It was just like a fact of life that I was doing all of those things at the same time. I would even go as far as, saying that, probably in Iran, if you go around and say, I just write novels because I'm a novelist, like I don't write, like newspaper columns or anything else, it kind of sounds a little kind of arrogant even. So writing, there's like a responsibility comes with writing, with being a writer, and people kind of expect you to, if something comes up, you kind of respond or react to it, or if there's a demand for this or that, you you address that too in your own writing as well. But nevertheless, for this book, definitely, I needed that background. If I weren't a journalist, in the sense that if I didn't know how to kind of interview people and get their stories, I wouldn't have been able to write this book, because I've never been either a bus driver or in solitary confinement, right? And maybe the bus driver or member of a workers' union. So maybe the bus driver, bit, you could kind of research yourself and go around and figure it out a little bit to create that atmosphere and that world. But what I learned through research is that it's absolutely impossible to write about time in solitary confinement without being there. So even like reading first-hand accounts and watching documentaries about solitary confinement didn't take me that far. So what I had to do was interviewing people who were there, and because I was kind of involved in politics in Iran, unfortunately I have a lot of friends who have been in solitary confinement, some of them for months. So I talk to them and interview and kind of gather their stories. And what you read in, especially in the solitary chapters in this book, is actually pretty close to reality. You know, it's like an amalgamation of accounts I got from maybe half a dozen people. Yeah, in that sense, that research or that background helped me a lot with figuring out, especially those chapters.
You know, I'm just going to bridge then to something I was going to ask in a moment, but since you're talking about research, then Ruvanee, maybe you could talk a little bit about the research that you did in the ceremonies that you talked about. So one of the things that is clear, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, reading the novel, is that in Sri Lanka, there are those people who practice those customs very seriously. There are people who look down on it as something that the villagers do. And then there's people in the middle who kind of say they don't believe in it, but maybe in the way that I would say, I don't believe in God, but God, if you're there, don't,
Right.
hurt me. So like, don't intellectually believe in it, but aren't 100% sure. So you grew up in Sri Lanka or were born in Sri Lanka and went to school in Sri Lanka. Were you very aware of these rituals yourself? Or did you have to do a lot of research? They're really spoken about and you describe them in great detail.
Yeah, so I did, yes, I grew up in Sri Lanka and I definitely knew about the rituals. It is really something that's sort of there undercover, even in the cities. So you do hear about them, and I had seen parts of a tovile that had been performed at a neighbor's house when I was a kid. So I remembered little bits of that, and I knew a lot of people who had either participated in these rituals or observed them, and so I talked to those people. I didn't really know too much about the details of the rituals because I hadn't observed them as an adult, and I didn't, when I was a kid, I hadn't seen all the minute details of what was going on, of course. So I did talk to a fair number of people and, heard their stories about this. And also I did a lot of research, reading anthropological works about these rituals. And that's really about all there is to read on them, because they're very secretive kinds of practices. People don't really talk. Even the people who have gone to these things, it's not something you just like discuss at dinner or, when you go to someone's house. You have to really, if you want to find out, you just have to, make sure that you know the people you're asking and, ask in the right way to get the information. So yeah, I did do a lot of research on that.
Okay, so the question for both of you, and maybe you could answer it first. So you wrote about these places where you were born, an informative place of your life, from a distance. And I wanted to know if you could talk about what you think the benefits were writing at a distance. Amir, were you at a distance when you were writing this, when you began this novel? Were you writing it here?
Yeah, but I mean, I moved to the US in 2016.
Okay.
Before that, I was in Australia for.
Okay, so you're writing at a distance, which can make you feel more aware of the distance as you're writing about it, or it can make you feel closer to the place. It can be a way of kind of causing homesickness, curing homesickness, or just having a different perspective. So I'm curious to know about that, as well as whether you think you will be writing about these places again. And Amir, if you could talk about this first. And Ruvanee, I know half of your novel is set in New Jersey, so with Montclair having a cameo. So I realize that, but just in talking about your birthplace and the place where maybe you came of age or were educated, what that felt like at a distance.
Yeah, it's when you kind of grow up somewhere and then you leave and kind of write about it, it's a weird, situation of being in and out at the same time, right? You never completely leave, but yeah, it's a part of you is there, then some other part of you is like in the new place, and you're kind of torn, between these two places. So that gives you a kind of a unique, point of view, unique angle on both places. Actually, if I start writing about the U.S., I will still be an outsider because the other part of me, hasn't moved here yet, or probably never does. Yeah. So you write, I was writing this book from this kind of paradoxical angle of being in and out of Iran at the same time. Like my body wasn't there when I was writing it, and I was not writing in a language that people speak there, and in a language that the events of this book take place. The supposed events of this book take place. So yeah, there are lots of difficulties to navigate, but at the same time, being like looking at it from outside, it gives you like almost like a helicopter view of that situation, right? That distance, especially from a place like Iran, which is like always kind of politically tense. It's always in headlines for not great news, not very good news. And and when you live there also, you feel that pressure all the time. There's like a stickiness, with just life in Iran. It's really hard to kind of move away from the moment, right? From the kind of your current life, and look at it, from a distance, because the politics of it is always kind of following you around, and it becomes really suffocating most of the times. So being outside the country gave me this opportunity, this gap, right? This room for breathing, which a novelist really needs, right? Because the novelist, you don't cover the news anymore, right? You need that gap. You need that distance, or there are all kinds of traps you can fall into. You can sentimentalize the situation. So there, yeah.
Though about it being the stickiness of it, I think that's really interesting, because I think that novelists write about the sticky things. Like these are the things that we're drawn to, the things that are kind of sticky in our brains and won't let go. So I can really understand how that happened for you for that place.
Yeah.
Ruvanee, do you?
Yeah, I agree very much with what Amir said. I think, I left Sri Lanka. I came to the North America for college. So I've been here a long time, but I still have very strong ties to Sri Lanka. And I consider myself to be both Sri Lankan and American. I'm an American citizen, but there are two parts of me, and sometimes they do well together, and sometimes they don't. And I think that my first book was. Is it okay to show it?
Please.
The Water Divine and Other Stories was a collection.
You have to show that again because it went like. Okay, good. Thank you.
Was about Sri Lankan immigrants and their experiences of being both inside and outside, feeling like they're insiders and outsiders at the same time, and the conflict between cultures and the push and pull of different kinds of attitudes and values and things like that. And I am very interested in this inside-outside distinction, or whether there is a distinction and what it means. And the Mask Collectors really does deal with that whole inside-outside issue. There's, for example, with respect to the rituals, there are really two or three different kinds of insiders. There's the village folk, and then there are the urban people, and then there's sort of the in-between people, as you said, Nancy. And also there are outsiders, but it's not just a black and white thing, you know, it's not a dichotomous thing, and inside versus outside. So outsiders also, there's the pharmaceutical company, and then there's Duncan, who's an outsider, but he's sort of an insider. And then there's Grace, who's an insider, but also sort of an outsider, right? So there's all of these different perspectives. There's the inside-outside distinction with respect to science versus the supernatural. So I really like to explore that. And there's something else that I wanted to say. It totally slipped my mind.
It'll come back to
you.
All right, I'm going to change the subject for a moment, because a lot of people do want to know a little bit about how you write. So first, I'm going to tell you the question that I hate when I get asked, and I'm not going to ask this question, but I will ask you an adjacent question. The question that I hate is, I don't know if you've ever been asked this horrible question, or maybe you wouldn't mind. Are you a plotter or are you a pantser? So for those who've never heard that question, the plotter writes outlines and works it all out in advance, and the pantser, by the seat of their pants, is just making it up as they go along. Why do I hate it? Plotter sounds so close to plotting. I think it automatically sounds like that's going to be a deadly dull book, even though I know many people who outline and write great books of literature that way. And pantser sounds so frivolous. And as somebody who writes not with an outline, but who is really serious about my work, I find that really offensive. So let's put that aside. But the question behind that question that I want to ask you is, your two novels, how closely or how far did they end up from the book that was in your head when you began to write it? And you know, there may have been some things that you set out to write that kind of took over because they interested you more than you knew. There might have been some things that turned out to be so hard to write about that you ended up not writing about that. But I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about where it ended up and where it started, how far the distance or how close. And Amir, maybe you could start us off.
Sure. I'm not sure if I had a book in my head before starting writing. What I had were like in moments, several moments, you know, like milestones, if you like, in this narrative. And yeah, I mean, I'm fine with the first question too, because they're kind of connected, so I can talk to that as well. What I do is that I know like kind of major turning points of the story. You know, those I figure them out in advance. And then I, you know, fill up like the gaps between them while writing. Mm-hmm. So it's like if I'm traveling like from here to say San Francisco, here being New York. Mm-hmm. So I know that, you know, I will go through like Chicago and like Detroit and wherever, right? So I know these three major kind of points on the, you know, on the way. But when I start, I have no idea how I'm gonna get to Chicago, right? Which highway should I take to get there? So I kind of make up, you know, as I fly. The same for this book. The same thing, you know, that was the process for this book as well. So I knew that there will be a strike in the terminal for the beginning. Then I knew how this bus driver would be arrested. I knew like, you know, certain things about the interrogation process, and I knew the ending. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know how, you know, I would get from like this point to that one, from point A to B, and that you know, kind of emerged during writing.
Mm-hmm. The hybrid model.
Yeah, that's hybrid. Yeah.
Ruvanee, how about you?
I started with the idea of the sort of the underlying idea that I was trying to get across about, you know, the placebo effect and these rituals. Mm-hmm. And I knew what the ending was, sort of, mm-hmm. Not the details of it, but the idea of the ending. Mm-hmm. And I also knew that it would start with a reunion, and that this international school would be involved. And the character, I knew that Grace would be in this book. Grace was a character who was in a short story that I wrote about a decade ago, and I developed that character into this present Grace. And then, I started writing, thinking about, how to get to the end point from this reunion. And after I had gone about maybe a third of the way, I realized that just writing like that was not going to work. Because this story, unlike my short stories, which I never ever outlined or tried to have any kind of conception of it before I wrote it, I found that this novel is really quite heavily plotted. There's a fairly intricate plot. And so there was no way for me to just keep in mind everything that was going on and was going to have to happen unless I kept some sort of record of, the events and what had happened and when it happened and how to connect it to the next part. And I think this was partly because of the fact that at the time I had a pretty demanding full-time academic job. And so I kept getting distracted by other things as I was writing. I was only writing on evenings and weekends. And then I couldn't keep track of, the way the plot would have to move. So eventually I wrote an outline. After writing a draft, I wrote a full outline. And then I was able to sort of see all the pieces.
Another version of the hybrid.
It's a hybrid one.
Right the first way, then you go back to the outline.
Right.
Okay, we're going to have a quick lightning round, and then we're going to go to audience questions. So we'll just have, I have 4 quick questions for you, just for fun. Okay, and the first one is most productive time to write, dawn or dead of night? Always, you can you can say neither and then tell me. But Amir, are you up there early or are you out there late?
Yeah, dawn is, I'm an early morning person. Yeah.
Okay. Ruvanee?
I would say morning. Dawn is too early for me, but morning.
Okay. Your version of dawn.
It used to be night, but now it's morning.
Okay. Sometimes family life decides that for us, I will say.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah. Okay. Reading your work aloud as you write. So I'm giving you 3 descriptions. Tell me which, if any of these are you. Okay. I do read aloud, but only at the final draft. I read aloud all the way through like a crazy person. I never read aloud. Do you read aloud? Ruvanee?
I don't read aloud.
You don't read aloud. Okay. Amir?
I read aloud the passages that kind of feel wrong, or something like when something is off with the writing, but I couldn't spot it. Then I read it out loud, and it actually, it's like a miracle sometimes. As soon as you start reading it out loud, you notice the problem. So yeah, I would say maybe like 20-30% of every book or story I read out loud, which means like 30% of time something is wrong with my writing. Great.
Only 30%? You're lucky.
No, 30% is something is wrong that I can't spot it. That's even worse. Yeah.
That's pretty fun. Okay, constructive criticism. So here's some more choices. I love constructive criticism, just not in the earliest drafts. Bring it on me. Bring it on. Thank you for saving me from myself. Or don't, too painful. No. Ruvanee.
I like constructive criticism a lot, but I don't show my work to people until I'm satisfied with that. So I think if I showed, very early stages, that would drive me nuts if I got too much feedback.
Yeah, same. I won't show it to anyone before I'm done.
Right.
And when I'm done, I think it's important who you show the work to. Very, very, very. It's very important. It's not necessarily the person who knows more about literature. It's someone who knows me well. So yeah, I don't care if it's constructive or not, but the feedback matters if it comes from the right person.
Okay, last lightning round question, and then we're going to go to the audience's questions. Okay, when talking about your next project in early days, is it out of the question? That's a way to kill an idea. Or please, yes, what would you like to know? That would be so helpful. Maybe Amir, you could start with this one. How do you feel about that?
A little bit. It's not, I don't kind of go to great lengths to describe it. But if I'm asked what you're working on, I give people, like an elevator pitch or, like maybe
Even in the early days when it's still kind of, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I know enough in the early days usually to give people like a paragraph length description of the story.
Interesting. Ruvanee?
Yeah, I will give people a very brief idea, but often in those early stages, it's not even clear enough to me that I can describe it in a way that sounds coherent to people. So usually it ends up sounding like something totally crazy.
Yeah.
That's what happens to me. It sounds so bad that halfway through the sentence, I'm like, oh, I'm not writing that. And so I'm a way to kill an idea. Okay, let's see what questions. Thank you guys so much. Let's see what questions we have. Okay, our first question is, I would love to know what language you write in.
That's English.
I write in English.
Okay. Who are some Sri Lankan and Iranian authors that you could recommend? That's a great question. That's a spot question because that can make your mind go totally blank. Like,
I just went completely blank. I actually don't know a whole lot of Sri Lankan writers, and that's something I should probably work on. I do. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I don't. What depends really what kind of writing you're interested in, or if it will like contemporary novels, like older, like classics, or maybe like modern, like 20th century literature. Yeah, it's a hard question to answer really, and yeah, if it's okay, I'm gonna
We'll move on. There's just a question. Here we go. So when you're writing, do you write with a particular person in mind? Do either a particular audience, or sometimes people do write with a particular person in mind. Some people write just to themselves. So who are you thinking of when you're writing?
I have no audience in mind when I'm writing. I just write, what comes out. So I don't have an audience in mind.
So you're in the story, you're writing, you're busy in the story, and you're not.
Yeah, right. I mean, later when I'm revising, I might think about, would this appeal to so and so? But I don't think I do that.
When you're doing it. How about you, Amir? Do you have someone in mind?
Yeah, no, and I'm not sure if it's like helpful or meaningful to do that.
Right.
To have an audience in mind, because first of all, when the book comes out, you're going to be absolutely surprised who reads it and who doesn't read it. Like the people you assume will be interested in this book, you'll never hear from them. But there are like random people you never thought of. Suddenly you get like an email from them or some comment somewhere. So that's I don't have it, and I don't see how anyone can have like a particular audience in mind while writing fiction. Maybe the only audience that I have are dead writers instead of living readers. Yeah.
Conversation with a writer that you have always thought a lot of.
Yeah.
Do you want to share? Somebody did ask, who do you like to read? Which is another question that can make your brain go completely blank. So I'm very sensitive to that. But if there is anybody that you hold up as somebody that you are a dead writer you're writing to, please feel free to share.
Yes. I mean, I don't know where to begin. There's so many. I like pretty much everybody else. I love the Russians, 19th century Russians. And I like Latin American authors of the boom generation, for instance. Those have been really huge for me. Like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, Julio Cortázar, that generation. I can just go on and on. There's lots of them. Yeah.
Okay. Shall I go on to the next question? Okay. Someone has. Let's see. The questions are appearing and disappearing. The last author suggested there are parallels between fiction and music and between writers and actors. Do you have any feeling about that? That is anything that you've thought about?
Yeah, writers and actors, maybe there is a connection. I think in a way, because when you're writing a character, I think you really do sort of get inside that character in the same way that maybe an act. I don't really act, so I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming that that's the same kind of thing that happens, where you have to become that character in a certain way to understand how they're acting and what they're feeling and so on.
That's true. And
yeah, the same. I don't know about music. So there's music definitely in writing, but it's very different from, music. Music's, comprised of like abstract notes, but in writing, like every word has connotations. So two different, I mean, music is very, like, you can kind of vaguely say there are parallels there, but I'm not sure if you can go too far with that.
Are you listening to music?
Yeah, I listen to music that doesn't have like vocal. Like if someone is singing, I'll be completely distracted.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll listen to like jazz or classical music.
Ruvanee, do you? I mean, I like to listen to background noise, but the same if there's lyrics.
I can't have any music of any kind. It has to, absolutely not. Silent. The only thing that I can really write with is, in terms of sound, is like nature sounds, which works great for me. But anything else would be totally distracting.
Let's see what else we have here. How much of writing is a craft versus an art? And can you learn to be a great writer?
Amir, do you want to go?
Sure. I maybe when I was younger, I took the art part maybe too seriously. But as I get older, more and more for me it becomes like a craft. I'll say maybe 70-80% of it is craft. People who are not writers sometimes don't believe how boring this process can be sometimes. How like drudgery, there's just moving words around, like just rewriting and editing and going back to the same sentence multiple times, like just deleting this word and replacing it with a word that is basically the same.
Right. And putting it back the next day.
Yeah. So increasingly I'm looking at this as, like a kind of a job, the way like a taxi driver has a job. For me, it's becoming more and more like my daily job, something that I have to do every morning. So there are days that it kind of pours out and they're like really amazing. One day you kind of sit down and you write a whole scene and it just comes out perfectly, and you feel this like catharsis almost, coming from those experiences. But those days are, few and far between. Most of days are not like that. It's pretty hard and draining.
So I would say that for me, I agree that revising can be a drag sometimes, but quite a lot. But in terms of the writing itself, I rarely find it to be work. I really feel like it's almost like a flow experience most of the time. I love to just write. If I could just sit here and write all the time, I think I would be fine. So I really do love the act of writing. Although I'm not saying, there aren't drudgery parts. There's definitely drudgery parts where you have to, work on particular parts that just don't work and all of that. But in general, I would say that it's a lot of, for me at least, there's like a happiness in writing. But skill developing the skills, I think, is also very important to figure out, how structures of sentences and the way to plot things and all of that is definitely requires practice and skill. It's not just like it's magic, but
what's so interesting is, and I found that I was on a panel once with somebody, and we were exactly, I like this person, but we were exactly the opposite. I love to revise. The time goes like this when I'm revising. I could work for 18 hours revising. When I'm writing something new, I work for what feels like 72 hours, and I look up at the clock and 3 minutes have passed and I need a nap. So it's really, people, we all have very different parts of it that's, engage us in different ways. This is the most glamorous part, though, being on at a literary festival on a Zoom. We just see if we have time for one more quick question. And here it is. How do you decide where to end a story? Full disclosure, I really could have kept reading a lot more at the end of Then the Fish Swallowed Him, but I also appreciated the open. I'm not even going to finish that sentence. We don't want anyone to know about the ending. But okay, is it hard? Did you write either of you, as you're writing your novels, write past the ending and then realize you had to chop off those 20 pages, or did you know this is it? Yay, done.
I find endings hard to do. That to me, I never really know whether the ending is right or not. So yeah, I mean, for me, that would be an example of something that I find difficult. But
I think your ending, I think you got it right. Just, I'm going to say that. How was your experience of the ending, Amir?
Yeah, the ending changed a lot in the editing, actually, when we, the book went to the publisher. So I think we cut about 30 pages out of the ending in my novel.
That happened where you stopped?
No, it's slightly before that. So when this character is condemned to, time in jail, those 4 years before it comes out, that was the longest chapter in the book, basically. It was 25, 30 pages. So we kind of cut that out, and some bits of it came as flashback in the last chapter. But the ending, that aside, the ending was pretty much what it was. I don't really remember if I had a different ending and I changed it. Maybe I should go back and read the first manuscript. But I think it was about the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes, tell me if you agree with this. Not that much time can pass after you publish a novel when you really have forgotten.
Oh yeah.
Yes, very easy to forget.
Yeah. Sometimes people ask questions about parts of the book I don't even remember.
Yeah. Or have you had experience if you read it much later? Your books haven't been out that long, but we're I wonder who wrote that. That was kind of a good book. You almost.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think we are moments away from ending our talk. Maybe we could end with, if you could each give just, if there are people listening and watching us today who are writing in the margins of their lives and aren't sure when it's okay to call themselves a writer, what advice you would give to somebody who isn't sure, if you haven't yet published, if you can consider yourself a writer, or if you really have to wait for that day when your work is first published?
I mean, I would tell them that there's no published writer who hasn't been rejected a million times. So they're just in the on the right track, right? Being rejected is a good sign. It's not a bad sign. It means you're kind of doing the right work. Yeah,
I support.
Yeah, I would say also that if you really enjoy doing it and if you feel like this is something you want to do, keep trying. Don't just give up, because it does take a long time to find the right outlets and all of that.
Well, I'm glad you both stuck with it. I thank you for being here. I think, Jackie, there you are, like magic.
Yeah, magic.
Thank you both for joining.
That was such a great talk, really fascinating. So thank you all for being here today. It's been a real pleasure. A reminder, please support our wonderful authors by buying their books via the green button below. They'll come for free. We wish to thank our festival sponsors, event partners, festival friends, volunteers, and festival staff, as well as everyone who's helped us put on our festival events today. We have some more events coming up today and tomorrow. The next talk is at 4 o'clock with 2 Korean American writers. That should be great. And take a look on our Crowdcast channel to sign up. Thank you guys for coming today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having
Thank you
us.
so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.